Hello there, Mandy here. Restorative Grief with Mandy Capehart is not just a podcast. It's also a book, a free online grief group, and a one-on-one private coaching practice. If you are interested in learning more, visit mandykapehart.com to find out how restorative grief can help you heal heart, mind, body, and spirit. Welcome back to Restorative Grief with Mandy Capehart. You are listening to episode 251, titled Tethered to Hope with Adriel Booker. You don't have to attain hope or even hold on to it. It's already holding you. There are seasons when life no longer looks like it once did, but the future hasn't come into focus either. Grief, loss, spiritual changes, identity shifts, and unexpected transitions can leave us feeling suspended between what was and what comes next. So today, we're exploring how we move through that uncertainty without abandoning ourselves. My guest is writer, speaker, and author Adriel Booker. Through her latest book, Tethered to Hope, Adriel offers language, wisdom, and companionship for people navigating grief, doubt, transitions, and the long process of becoming. Hey everyone, welcome back to Restorative Grief with Mandy Capehart. I'm your host, Mandy, of course, and today my guest is Adriel Booker. She's the author of Tethered to Hope, this beautiful new book that just the cover caught my attention, let alone the content. And I want you to hear this secondary title, The Quiet Kindness of God in Crisis, Change, and the Spaces in Between. When I saw this work, I was so excited to bring it to you because it discovers the liminal spaces in life, really looking into the seasons when something has ended and something else is beginning, but we don't know what to do in the transition where grief typically shows up. So today we're going to talk about all of that loss in the middle and how to understand our identity and our faith and becoming without rushing ourselves toward a resolution. So Adriel, welcome to Restorative Grief.
Thank you, Mandy. It's good to be with you and have some time together today.
Yeah, I'm so grateful for this time with you. I think there is a very special wisdom from people who can recognize and name the liminal spaces in grief, because we panic when we see unresolved or uncertainty in front of us. And so I'm curious, what first drew you to an awareness of and the importance of these liminal spaces, and why does that matter for those of us who are grieving?
Well, I think for me, it really started as, sorry, Mandy. For me, it really started as sort of looking at my life and the life after. Um, I had had experience with multiple miscarriages, and that was some of the worst, most difficult and heavy grief of my life to that point, and recurrent miscarriages. And, I felt like in that season where I was actively grieving those losses, a sort of, there was a sort of grace that I felt able to access. I really felt that there's that scripture in Matthew that says that God is near to the brokenhearted. And I really felt that. I felt that, I felt the closeness of God in those times of fresh grief. I felt the support of friends. I felt that life was hard, but I could connect. And I think it was really after when the dust sort of settled and that acute grief wears off, the casseroles stop coming, where I started to feel like I've lost my equilibrium. My life isn't what it was like before this started happening to me. And I also feel like, we threw that phrase around a lot during COVID and the pandemic years, the new normal. And I sort of felt like I hadn't found my new normal yet. And I was in this sort of hard to define, ambiguous sort of in between space. I think that liminality that you're mentioning. And so for me, it was it felt like a crisis after my crisis. Like the first crisis was obvious I could easily name it, put language around it. But that's sort of the after bit where you're still floating sort of between where you were and where you're going to be. It just felt a lot harder to put language around. It felt a lot harder to understand and define. And it really did feel like some sort of a crisis after the crisis, or sometimes in the book I call it just the after crisis, because it's not that sort of acute in your face crisis, but there's those elements of crisis in there that I think I know for me. And then I've worked with people for a long time as well, and looking around at patterns that I was seeing in others that I've worked with, that I felt like this is pretty normal. Actually, it doesn't make it easy, but it seems to be fairly common. And in those sort of after crisis seasons or periods, it seemed like that's really when people start to call their faith into question, their identity into question, um, and reevaluate some of the scaffolding that's helped hold us up before that might not feel like it's working.
Yeah. I love the word scaffolding. I use it often because that's such an apt way to describe what it feels like when you recognize, oh, the casseroles have stopped. The immediacy of the crisis, the acute nature of it has kind of come to an end. And yet here I am feeling like there's still more that needs to be addressed. And I think that um, openness, that uncertainty, all of those little secondary losses that come along are so disruptive to people. So I love that you started to recognize it as well around you and say, maybe this is more universally experienced than myself. But, one of the things I think about in that is how you named it so beautifully as describing crises as turning points rather than just isolated events like this event happened and it was triggering and this event happened. They become opportunities for us when we are capable of recognizing that liminality. What changed for you when you began paying attention in the liminality instead of feeling like you were floating without a proper scaffolding?
Yeah, I think for me there wasn't this moment of change. Obviously, like I'm human, change happens incrementally. I'm just like the next guy. But I had, because for me, my years of grief happened over, a long period. I had 4 pregnancy losses, and they were intermixed with live birth as well. And so there wasn't just this clear sort of those are the grief years, these are the non-grief years. Anyone that's grieved anything knows that grief bleeds in and out of your life. And so I know I'm preaching to the choir. I don't need to explain that to you or to your listeners, but I think when I sort of got to the place where I was starting to think, oh, I'm sort of after that acute phase that we were talking about, that's when I started to, yeah, really explore like what does it mean to continue to hold my grief, because there's still things I'm grieving about. I'm not the old me. I don't have the same perspectives that I used to have, or the things that perhaps made me feel safe or secure before are different. Um, but I had to learn and to find some new language around it. And one of the things I learned as I was sort of studying in this area was the word crisis itself actually started as a medical term. And it was a medical term that sort of defined or described, that's the word I'm looking for, described the place in a disease or in a sickness where whatever it was, that thing was going to either turn toward healing or was going to turn toward death. And so it was like a pivotal point, right? It was
Oh,
so the crisis
yeah.
was not the fact that you were sick, although, so we sort of, in our modern English language, we use crisis for the event, that's happened. But in this, originally in the medical terminology, crisis was for that point where the disease took a turn for the worse or the turn for the better. So the crisis point wasn't, oh, I wasn't healed, now I am, or I was alive and now I'm not. But the crisis point was that pivot, that went, okay, now I'm moving in the direction toward healing, or I'm moving in the direction toward death, really. And so I felt like that was a really interesting way to look at crisis. And, are we able to sort of identify a point that we reach? And it might just be you alone with your journal one day at the end of yourself going, I'm like, I just can't keep going under the weight of this anymore. And there's a pivot for you, and a pivot toward healing. And maybe it's not a one-off. Maybe it's a many, you know, points of realignment toward, okay, I just want to keep continuing to point myself toward healing. Um, and I think as a writer, I love metaphor, and I find that so helpful to use metaphor, in my life, and to describe, to help give me language for what I'm feeling and experiencing. And I don't think that's exclusive to writers by any means, but I know for me, when I was really in that after crisis time in my life, where I was grappling with all the middle bits and the confusing, I really leaned into metaphor, and so for me, it was, what my metaphor felt like was a dark night of the soul. Some people might choose a metaphor like a wilderness experience, or a metaphor, any number of metaphors. And I explore some of them in the book, but there's so many more, but just to kind of, for me, give language and help articulate what I was going through. So what it felt like for me personally was, it just felt very dark. And I don't mean dark just in a I don't mean dark just in a sort of just in a metaphorical sense. I mean, I felt like almost my senses went dark. Like it felt hard for me to hear, and if you're listening, I'm doing air quotes now, but hear God. It felt hard for me to see God. It felt hard for me to feel God. It's like my senses almost, where in my early days of grief, my senses felt totally heightened. It's like I just felt like I could see and hear and sense God everywhere. That was my experience. I know that's not everyone's, but that was my experience. But then in this sort of after crisis, I felt like, oh, none of my senses are working anymore. I can't see God. I can't hear. And it just, everything felt quite dark and opaque, which is really characteristic of, how St. John of the Cross talks of dark night of the soul. So for me, that's what it felt like. It felt like darkness. It felt like confusion, and it felt like, yeah, it just felt really hard to find my bearings, because I couldn't feel, I felt like I couldn't see and hear and sense and see the way that I had been able to before in the past.
Yeah. Yeah, the richness of what you just described makes me think a lot about how you discuss the art, like the act of becoming, that we are constantly becoming. And this is another concept that I am often intrigued by, because grief reveals so much of our opportunity to grow. We don't want it to be a growth opportunity, but it certainly is, among other things. But I'm curious about how that experience of darkness and kind of a lack of almost attunement, right? Almost just a loss of being able to catch the wavelength of what you're used
Yeah.
to and recognize guidance and care and insight in the way maybe that you were used to. How did that affect your awareness of becoming and of being in where you are now, and also being in a state of growth and transformation moving forward, with this sense of like, oh, wait a minute, it's quieter than it should be, it's darker than it should be. I don't know if this is something I can trust as I'm becoming more like this, or is this my new normal that I'm not so interested in? Or like, what shifts now? What has grief taught you about who you are in that kind of a moment?
Oh, I think, I have the benefit of working closely with people for many years, for 20 years. And so I sort of bring almost to my personal life, I bring this experience of having heard stories and stories and stories, and having walked with people through their own hardship and their own life transformations. Um, and so I have to acknowledge that, what I've seen and observed in others, um, and what I've thought I've known to be true because of those observations. And so I think, to answer your question in short, like, I didn't feel for myself, I didn't feel this sense of like, oh, I'm becoming someone new, when life is difficult. I think cognitively, maybe intellectually is a better word. Intellectually, I knew that, okay, I'm becoming someone new, and I've seen this pattern, in people that I've worked with. And so I think intellectually you can go, oh, I know I'm growing through this. I know this is stretching me into new areas. Um, but if you're really honest with yourself, which we try to be, it's not always easy to be honest with ourselves. But when I'm trying to be honest with myself, going through that, it's very easy to just go, well, I saw the growth in others, but it's not happening in me. Yes, this is a pattern I've seen in others, and I've seen people grow through grief. But for me, like, I think I've done all my growing, and now I'm just flailing. You know, like, oh yeah, I can see growth in the past, and that was phenomenal, and I'm so thankful for it. And I never want to go through that grief again, but I do love some of the
Yeah.
things that it's done to change me and work in me. But right now, no, not this. This isn't working. And I think I really struggled. And my husband and we were going through this at the same time. We were both sort of, I don't know, sort of turning over our after crisis in different ways. And so in some ways it was easy to look at each other and go, oh, I can see what maybe God is doing in you, or I can see how this is working its way through you, but it's a lot harder to see it in yourself. So I think that was a gift to
Mhm.
me, that, that I had that safe relationship for us reflecting back on one another. Um,
Mhm.
but yeah, it's not always clear or obvious when you're in the midst of it. And this is where it gets a little bit tricky, because I think this is where we can, I don't know, this might be triggering for some listeners, but this is where we can, like, apply our faith. And this is where we can go,
Mhm.
okay, faith is leaning into things that don't yet feel tangible to me, but I'm going to lean in anyway. And man, the last thing we need when we're grieving is for people to be like, just have more faith, everything's going to be fine. Like, that's the opposite of helpful, right? But I think there are points where I know that my own self-talk and my own honesty before the Lord was like, I need to lean in to what I don't yet believe, or maybe what I used to believe, and I don't believe at the moment. But also, I'm kind of willing for that to all fall aside if it's not right, And I think that's where sometimes people call that deconstructing, or, um, and I've had periods of deconstructing, more than one, throughout my life. So it's not a new thing to me. It doesn't feel as scary as maybe, initially. For me, it's just sort of part of the faith journey of like, all right, this doesn't work for me anymore. What do I do with it? Let's see what we can untangle. Um, but yeah, there is that sort of, during moments, leaning into the intellectual knowledge you have when your experiential knowledge hasn't quite caught up. Um, and that's there's a it's a fine line to walk between sort of leaning into what you think you know to be true, but also being real about how you actually feel, and being honest with yourself and
Yeah.
honest with God. And I think that was one of my big takeaways from that time in my life, was that God can handle any and all of the honesty that I'm willing to offer. And what really helps me to understand that is my relationship with my kids. You know, and we often tell the kids, like, we'd rather know the truth, even if it sheds a bad light on you because of your decisions. We'd rather
Yeah.
know the truth so that we can work with you there. than, for you to just pretend like everything's fine. And I genuinely mean that with my kids. And that little thought alone helps me to be more honest with God. It really does.
Well, and what a beautiful recognition, too, of this open handedness that we're invited to live with. I've been saying the phrase open handed hopefulness for a while now. And what you were just describing makes me feel like that is very aligned. This idea that we don't have to set aside our hopefulness because our faith has changed or because something we once believed was true and applied wholeheartedly doesn't feel so true or doesn't feel so applicable anymore. But that understanding that we do have an opportunity to connect with someone that has open handedness for us, that has grace for us in our mistakes, that has awareness of all the things that are going on anyway, knows what it's like to be a teenager, for example, and is willing to say, I actually love you regardless. Why don't you settle into that before you try and resolve, before you try and figure your way out through this? Because that's even its own liminal space, right? A kid coming to their parent and saying, I have to talk to you about this and I hate it and I don't want to. That itself is this loss of identity. And like, I make good choices, I make good um, decisions in the world regarding other people. Whatever identity piece can come up and feel compromised when we're in the middle of grieving something, whether it is a death or a future or a decision or a relation, all the different things we can grieve, there is always a liminal place in between where we really do have a decision, like you were describing. And I think that knowing that we have gone through so many disconnections in our um, experience of grief and sometimes in our spiritual practices, that you've just described such a beautiful invitation to stay not disconnected, but to stay open and available to movement within it, right? Not stay distant, not rush toward, but really just stay flexible. Maybe that's what I'm trying to summarize and what I'm hearing. How would you describe that flexibility when it comes to like understanding that we can remain tethered to hope, right? It's different than certainty, and being able to just stand still in a space of unknown and feel like we are tethered to something is a very, well, it's kind of a mentally contradictory thing to understand. So, how do you define hope for someone who's feeling kind of like, okay, well, I'm here in the middle of nowhere and I don't know what I believe anymore and I don't know what I'm connected to?
Yeah, I think this is one of the things that I really struggled with when I started writing. um, Tethered to Hope was many years ago. This was a long process, this particular book. And I really started from this perspective of, okay, I want to explore the things that keep us tethered to hope. And I genuinely thought I was going to be looking more at practices, mindsets, and things like that. What are the things that keep me tethered to hope? And I had this moment, and it's so embarrassing, but it is what it is. And I was really struggling on the writing, and it just wasn't working, and I was crying, like crying, like sob crying, the embarrassing, ugly sort of can't control yourself crying. And I was praying and
Yeah, the really
crying.
good
Yeah, it
stuff.
was like got off my desk, and I was like on the floor, like maybe if I'm like kneeling on the floor, like on my face, God will listen. This was during the years where everything felt dark. So I was also trying to write during those years, which is that's its own thing.
Good on you. Yeah, way to
Yeah, so
go.
I was writing, and I was like, God, I've made a huge mistake. Like, I don't feel tethered to hope. It's ridiculous for me to try and write this. Like, you know, job great, person wrong for the job. Wrong person for the job. Love the book. You should get someone else to write that kind of thing. But I was a mess. And I just had this experience where I was there in all of my tears and snot and dismay. And I felt like God just dropped something into my spirit, which was, you don't have to stay tethered to hope. you are tethered to hope, you know? And I just, yeah, it was this paradigm shift for me going from I need to figure out how to stay hopeful, and me realizing, oh, I have hope because I am tethered to God. And I actually can't sever that tether. And I use the word tether. And I know tether sometimes can have a connotation of like a leash, like holding things in, keeping things at bay. You know, you've got a tether so a ship doesn't, or so a little, what's it called, a dinghy doesn't, float off the main ship, right?
Totally.
So it's sort of like a keeping things in. And that's not really what I mean when I say tether. I like to use the metaphor of an umbilical cord. An umbilical cord is a tether between the mother and the child, and that child is connected. There's a lifeblood and a nourishment and a safety and, yeah, life itself that comes through that tether, through that umbilical cord that the child doesn't control. The child is the recipient of it, and it is two-way. There is movement back and forth between the mother and the child through that umbilical cord, but it's not the child's responsibility to grow it. It's the mother's body that does that. And I love thinking of our tether to hope being like that umbilical cord to God, that maybe we can't hold on any longer. Maybe we can't force ourselves to hope, but actually we could be as hopeless or as helpless, as ever, and yet we're still connected.
Mhm.
The life is still there. It's connected. And so for me it became less about believing that I was still tethered to hope, but and more about, okay, how do I quiet my own noise, internal noise, to start seeing the quiet kindness of God that's already around me. And those are the things that help you feel hopeful, but they don't create hope. We have hope because we're connected, but then we begin to feel hopeful when we can see and sense and feel God around us and kindness around us.
This makes me think a lot about people who are struggling with the concept of God, or they're struggling with the concept of hopefulness in a spiritual sense. And there is a correlation between a concept of hope and bypassing, I think, in the church that we get wrong all the time as church people.
Yeah.
What is your experience with bypassing grief for the sake of hopefulness? I think you mentioned it earlier, people coming to you and saying, like, just be hopeful, just have more faith, because we know that that doesn't feel good. But how have you encountered that? And how have you helped your own heart to remember, hey, you can actually have both? You can be present in both things.
Yeah, I mean, we're famously terrible at in our collective spaces in the church. Um, and I'm speaking from a Protestant perspective, so I can't speak for other traditions, but that's my tradition. We're famously terrible at sort of collective grief. We're good at the one-on-one show up with the casserole, but we're not good at sort of acknowledging grief in our congregational settings. And so I think that that sort of reinforces this idea that when you are active in your faith, you're joyful, right? When we gather, we're celebrating, we're praising, we're joyful, we're giving thanks, and all those things are very important. So of course, but in our collective spaces, we're not good at holding space for grief. We're not good at lament, and all of these things were a very rich part of our faith tradition that have gotten lost through the years. And so I think sometimes it's not even others coming to us and saying, be hopeful or just have faith. It's actually just our own narratives that we've created about what there go the air quotes again, what we should and shouldn't um, look like as people of faith. And we've got all this sort of baggage around what it looks like to be a genuine walking with God Christian. that it must mean that we're, able to sort of see all of our problems. It stems from a almost a prosperity gospel mindset that we, like if you connect with God, like everything's going to be fine. Life's going to work out. You're going to get the relationship you want and the kid you want and the job and the house you want and the health you want and everything's going to be great. And so we sort of can take these like really terrible theologies with us into our grief spaces and assume, or other people assume for us, it might be a mixture of both, that, yeah, we just got to get over ourselves and pray more or keep following the disciplines more or whatever. And that's going to fix our spiritual life. But I think when you look back over tradition, or even if you just look in scripture itself, it's, the Psalms are absolutely full of lament. And so for me, that was a really important part of being real in my faith, is going, I just have to be who I am. And I've actually have some mentors that have gone before me, and it's all recorded there in scripture, and that gives me permission. That gives you permission. But if we're willing to engage in those areas, even of scripture, that maybe are glossed over when everything's fine. Like we're not going to, like most, when life is good, it is not normal to like hang out in the lamenting Psalms. It's not. We skip over them. Like the normal thing is to skip to the ones that feel good. That's pretty normal. And when I say normal, I mean common. I don't mean, I'm not connoting good or bad, just common. And, but I think when you are in a difficult space, like we have to remember that actually there is precedent for us, and it's all through scripture and it's all through our faith tradition. When you look back over the centuries, there's actually room for grief, personal grief and collective grief. And that makes us whole and human and more honest and more able to fully experience the kindness of God, because God does draw near to the brokenhearted. And God does comfort those who mourn, but you can't experience the comfort of God unless you're willing to mourn. Like that's how it works. Like if you mourn, you will be comforted. If you don't mourn, you won't be comforted.
You said something a moment ago about how it's almost the prosperity gospel. And I would argue that it is the prosperity gospel, and we're terrified of admitting it because, like you said, corporately, like as a collective, there's so much fear of doing something wrong or saying the wrong thing, or, oh, I'm not educated enough to understand this, so I have to listen to their interpretation of the scripture or their wisdom. But when you get us into individual settings, when the one-on-one conversations happen, some honesty and some human nature gets to surface. And I think there's a lot more uncertainty that's available to honor and to validate,
Yeah.
as opposed to my experience in the collective was never as well, never is a harsh word. Okay. Was so frequently joyful that it felt, and it felt wrong to not feel so joyful. And once upon a time, I'll be really quick. I was a worship leader and for a long time. And one of the songs we sang was Joy to the World, but it was this new version that was basically like pop, almost pop punk, but it was shouting um, joy to the world. And like, I've got joy, I've got joy, I've got joy, I've got like over and over and over. And I remember looking at everyone else thinking like, imagine being in the front row and having people shouting this in your face when you are filled with lament and
Yeah.
heaviness. And this is the, like, every time we had to lead that, I was like, I don't want to. I want us to be more cognizant of how much pain is in this space, not to go down that road, but to make it okay for that person who doesn't recognize that they are inherently tethered to hope. And it is okay to be sorrowful. It is okay to not feel like you have joy overflowing. And in fact, how can we be with you when you feel so low? Um, I'm curious about your own experiences in the Protestant tradition. Like when it comes to that collective awareness, do you feel like individuals have started to come forward and say, yeah, liminality is great. Uncertainty is actually okay. There's hope in the unknown and the mystery of what could be possible? Or are you feeling like maybe that's a Western thing since you're in Australia now and there's more like understanding of, nope, we've got to stick to this tradition, this collective mindset of just have some faith.
Oh, I don't know. I think individually, I mean, I think that we'll get really philosophical here. Um, have you ever read any of Phyllis Tickle's work? She's a theologian
Oh,
who's written.
I have a long time
Okay.
ago.
So she talks about, she really looks at the history of the church, and she looks at the church having major transitions every 500 years. And we're due. We're in one right now. And I think of that often. I think that we're in a transition. And I don't know that it's going to be easy to articulate everything that happened until we are the historians looking back on this period. Um,
Mm.
but I think there is so much movement in and out of the church at the moment. And I think that there is a lot of movement out of the church um, individually because people don't feel well. There's lots of reasons and layers, that we could go into, and
Yes.
all sorts of things, and just our times and the politics of our times and so many different things. But I think that what I've observed is there's still not a lot of space in many churches for uncertainty. There's still not a lot of space. And, eventually, if people are showing up to church week on week, and their spirituality is important to them, their faith is important, but if they're showing up week on week and they're struggling and they're being shouted at about joy, when actually all they want is a bit of comfort and a bit of solidarity in their pain, they're going to eventually stop coming because they don't feel there's place for them there, and they feel that they have to pretend. You know, um, how many people do you know just stay home from church on Mother's Day Sunday, right? Or other
Yes.
things like this is actually really common. And that just breaks my heart because you would hope that when the family of God gathers, that would be the very safest place to bring the biggest spectrum of emotion, the biggest spectrum of life experience, the biggest,
Yeah.
spectrum um, of identity challenges and struggles, all of that stuff. But what it should be and what it is aren't always the same. And so I think, yeah, maybe individually, when you have those conversations, it feels like there's more room. But collectively,
Mhm.
to me, it still feels like, no, there's an expectation that when you're there and you turn it on. And I think that's a cry and shame because we're alienating people that want to connect with God. And I am not saying that there's no room for joy in the midst of our pain. That's a myth as well. Like those things don't need to be pitted against one another. It's a paradox, sure, but there's joy that's available even in our darkest times. But I think that's where we have to be honest about, like, what does it mean to give thanks, like truly, when we're in pain?
Mhm.
What does it mean to actually voice our confusion or our loneliness when we're in pain? And then what does it take to give thanks anyway? What does it take to receive someone's kindness as a spot of joy in our life anyway? You know? And so, yeah, I think the church is going back to the top of our conversation. I think the church is at a crisis point right now. And it's not a singular moment in time, but it's a moment in time, a large moment in time that I think history will help us look back on, and we'll go, okay, that's when the church pivoted this way or that way. And I think we're right in the
Yeah.
middle of that now. That's my gut sense. I'm not a historian, but that's my gut sense. And
Yeah.
And I feel like that can be really hard to make sense of when we're right here in the middle of it.
Well, and especially when you're recognizing that it could very well mean that more areas of your life are about to experience an
Mm.
upset, are about to experience loss or disruption, and that multiple liminal spaces at once is very confusing, to say the least. So, and I feel like you and I could have really long, rich conversations about where this is headed, which is wonderful. But I just want to ask this one last question before we wrap up about the whole of your book is this reminder to look at the quiet kindness of God and recognize the opportunity to access hope when we're in crisis, when we're in liminal spaces, and when we're in transition. And so I just wonder, what is the one last thing that you hope someone who's listening and who is in the middle of a transition and feels very lost or detached, what do you hope they will carry with them from this conversation?
Mm. I mean, a few things. I hope that they'll carry with them one, that they're not alone in it. You can feel very lonely, and that's okay. Like, that's very common. But also, um, being lonely doesn't mean that you're alone. There's many people that find themselves in that spot. And I think that's helpful to remember. Another thing I hope people would carry with them is that assurance that liminal spaces aren't forever. They're just not. It's like the best metaphor I can think of is like an airport terminal when you're on a layover from, between, you've got two legs of your flight, and that it's that layover city in the middle where that destination is actually really important because you are changing planes and you are changing direction a little bit, but all of it is helping move you forward. If you skipped that layover, it would be detrimental, but also like it's not where you're going. You're not going to live there. It is temporary. Um, and our liminal spaces often have kind of fuzzy edges, at least on the exit parts of it. The entrance might be like, oh, this particular event or thing happened and it just thrust me into this liminality. But the exit out of it is often a lot more fuzzy. And so that can feel hard to know, like, how long is this going to last? Am I out? Am I coming out? What's the end? And try to like figure out how to get out, but to sort of make yourself at home, as at home as you can in that layover space, knowing that you're not going to be there forever, but while you're there, like, how do you just be there? um, and so yeah, I hope that people will take away um, that liminality won't last forever. And then lastly, so I know you said one thing, so I'm giving you three, but
I
yeah.
like it. You're
And then
generous.
lastly, I just really hope that people will know that God's quiet kindness is tucked and buried and around every little corner and under every stone. And I call it quiet because often when we're in the middle of something really difficult, we're looking for a miracle. We're looking for a big, flashy, obvious, clear miracle. And I've been the recipient of miracles a couple of times, and it's amazing, and shout it from the rooftops, hallelujah, we love a miracle. But most of life is not a big, flashy miracle. Most of life is loud and noisy and distracting and confusing. And sometimes the real miracle is not loud and showy, but it's actually quiet and tucked away, but it is there. And that's what I want to encourage people is, sometimes it's a matter of just quieting our own souls enough so that we can perceive the kindness that's around us, and the kindness, God's kindness, that takes lots of different forms around us. But it may not show up in the loud, showy miracle that we just think, oh, if this one thing could happen, it would solve everything or it would fix everything. And often it's just those small, almost imperceptible moments of kindness and acts of kindness that God places around us so that we can see, oh, God is still here and God is present, even if I'm struggling to see or hear or perceive.
Adriel, as someone who has also experienced many miscarriages and who has gone through many liminal spaces and currently occupy a number of them myself, I am just so grateful for your time and your wisdom and the hard heart work that you did to move through these spaces and write this book to share with us, because I know these aren't easy stories to tell. So I'm just so grateful to have had this time with you. And before we go, I'll put links in the show notes for people to find out how to get a copy of your book. But if anyone wants to learn more about you and your work, where can they reach you?
Yeah, I'm in all the normal places under Adriel Booker. So my website's adrielbooker.com, and all my social media is Adriel Booker. And my Substack is called The Foundry, and I write a newsletter on Substack. I love to see people there as well.
Beautiful. Thank you again so much for making time. This was wonderful.
Thank you, Mandy. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you for listening to episode 251 of Restorative Grief. Most of us spend far more of our lives in the middle than we expect, between endings and beginnings, between certainty and mystery, between the stories we've outgrown and the ones we have not yet learned to tell. These in-between spaces can feel disorienting, but they also invite us into a deeper relationship with ourselves, our grief, and the quiet, important work of becoming. So perhaps our invitation is not to escape the middle, but to learn how to inhabit it with gentleness. Links for Adriel's book and her additional work are available in the show notes, so please check those out. And if this was your first time joining me for the show, I'm so glad you're here. I'd love for you to subscribe and leave a 5-star review, or consider becoming a patron. Supporting the show keeps the work going and unlocks bonus episodes and reflective workbooks to deepen your practice. And as always, before we go, one last thing. Please remember, the only solution for grief is to do the work of grieving. Thank you for listening. I'll see you next week.